Welcome, everyone, back to Eagles Power Hour, your Eastern Washington affiliate on the Big Sky Podcast Network. I am here joined with Tubs at the Club's very own Brian Marceau to preview the Idaho game. Brian, how are you doing today?
Doing well, man. Taking a quick break from studying. So that's why you guys are seeing, if you're watching, that's why you're seeing the room the way it is, maybe an echo. But dude, this is a huge game that from both ends kind of got more interesting, I think, over the last couple of weeks. So yeah, good to be here.
Right, and it's kind of a weirdly competitive matchup of I feel like both teams have been slightly disappointing. Like Idaho came out looking like a top 5 team, and then now just injuries have kind of slowed them down. Eastern looked like maybe a preseason team that should be in the bubble of playoffs, and they're 2-5. Both teams have things going for them, things going against them, and you know we'll just roll this right into how has Idaho been so far this year, and what has kind of led them to this point with the matchup with Eastern.
So the Vandals sit at 5-3 on the season, 2-2 in Big Sky play. You talked about disappointing, and I mean you can't really start to talk about the Vandals season without talking injuries. Like the Vandals lost starting quarterback Jack Lane first game in that road loss to University of Oregon, aka number one FBS, University of Oregon. And look, early on, all the way through about UC Davis, Idaho's defense was looking pretty damn good. Like, look, hey, don't get me wrong. The defensively, Idaho's a defense first team. That's probably how you should understand who they are. But the first 4 or 5 games of the season, Idaho's depth up front was clearly an issue for this counts 2 FBS games plus FCS games. Injuries have started to take a little bit of a toll on the defensive side of the ball. Of note for Eastern fans, Idaho has injuries to their cornerbacks number 1 through 4 right now, with 2 of them very likely out against Eastern. But for sure, Abraham Williams, also All-American kick returner, he's out. Andrew Marshall got hurt last week against Cal Poly. He's unclear. He was hurt early versus Cal Poly. Did not come back. By the way, he's their punt returner as well. So that's some special teams hit. But the route of Idaho to 5-3 is defensively they've been pretty damn good. But since losing Jack Lane, for the most part, Idaho's been what I think of as lost offensively. In Big Sky play, they're averaging 22.5 points a game. That's after, scoring 34 against Cal Poly. So for a good amount of the season, Idaho, when they've got the ball, they've been, progressing kind of like an advanced grade version of Northern Colorado. They've had to rely on big plays from backup quarterback Jack Wagner, who this week was added to the Jerry Rice Award list, as a nominee. But he's kind of a weird story. Wagner started as the number 2 quarterback. Then he was elevated number 1 when Lane, went down week 1. Then Wagner got hurt a little bit, but I'm pretty sure Nick Josepek, actually the number 3, that start of season number 3 quarterback, pretty sure he won that job because he started against Montana State after splitting reps the week before. But then Josepek broke his collarbone. So if you're keeping track, that's 2 broken collarbones for sure, plus a shoulder injury to Wagner. So Wagner's back running the show. He had his best game of the season, I think, against Cal Poly, which spoiler alert, a lot of people do. But the basic Idaho offense under Wagner is this isn't the Idaho last couple of years where they're having these long methodical drives. It just doesn't work that way. Idaho's having, in the past game, they're relying on bigger chunk plays when the completions are there. We're not seeing a lot of passing towards the middle of the field and very few intermediate passes for Wagner, and I think that's an accuracy issue. But Wagner does have an arm. He has been effective. Number 1 target has been Jordan Dwyer, but hey, Mark Hamper is another guy. He's the number 2 receiver for Idaho, led the team in receiving yards last week. He is coming alive a little bit in the receiving room. Injuries have also kind of kicked Idaho's ass on the ground too. I mean, Jason Eck, historically, this goes back to South Dakota days. His play split is very often somewhere around 60% run, 40% pass. There's obviously some variation there, but it's around that template. Idaho has not been able to do that quite as much because against Cal Poly, they're down to their number 3 running back. Art Williams was their starter. The top 2 running backs, Elisha Cummings and Nate Thomas. I wouldn't think of those as 1 and 2. It's kind of 1A, 1B. They've both been pretty good on the season. They're the 2 combined to rush for over 100 yards per game combined for 6 touchdowns. Nate Thomas, more the short yardage back. Elisha Cummings is he runs a little bit more on the outside, more likely to be a pass catching threat. But that's kind of the basics of Idaho's offense. They want to move the ball on the ground, but when they're moving the ball through the air, it's pretty much chunk plays, it's passes towards the sidelines. That's just how it's been with Jack Wagner under quarterback. Might as well throw an asterisk though. Jason Eck has referenced the Eastern Washington game as the best case scenario return time for original starter Jack Lane. So if that's the case, we're going to see Idaho offensively against an FCS team in a way we have not seen in 2024. But when Lane has started, he started twice against Idaho State over the last 2 years. And hey, yeah, it's Idaho State, but when he's there, Idaho's pass attack has been pretty dynamic. There's too many Jacks on this team. Jack Lane is very good at going through his progressions quickly. When he started, the tight ends in Idaho are much more likely to be involved, but he also had developed a bit of a connection with Jordan Dwyer as well. So I guess I'd watch for that if Jack Lane's there. But if you're an Eastern fan, until you see number 2 walk out under center for Idaho, he's not. So that means that, what I described with Jack Wagner, where they're trying to build the run game, but they're having to rely on the deep pass, that's kind of what Idaho's been offensively.
Right. And so, like you said, when Jack Wagner is heading the team, it's a lot more of a run the ball, play action pass type of team. They want to hit you with the run, then they'll hit you with the play action deep shots. And I mean, honestly, more often than not, they have been making those plays with Jack Wagner at quarterback. It just kind of depends on the matchup. It's definitely they tend to be pretty consistent with what they want to do. And that last week they tried to mix in a little bit more of the short pass game with Wagner, and it just wasn't working.
Yeah, for that, I mean, that's describing the rough first half for Idaho versus
Right.
the second half when they went back to play action. That's where that was easily Wagner's best game completion wise on the season. He's right around 50%. Against Cal Poly, he was 17 to 23 for 347 yards, 3 touchdowns and a pick. Easily his best game of the year. But again, as an Idaho fan, any results you get against Cal Poly, let's not get too excited about that because Eastern and Cal Poly aren't the same thing.
Right. And so just overall, the Idaho offense has been generally kind of bad, right? They're a bottom half offense in the Big Sky. They're only really, I think, let me look up really quick. They're averaging 23-ish points a game on the year. In conference, it's like 22-ish.
22 and a half in conference.
22 and a half. So, they've struggled putting points on the board in conference games, but also they haven't exactly played a gauntlet of they've played a pretty good stretch of defenses, right? They've played teams that generally are. I mean, they've played Montana State, they've played Davis, who we saw last week. Good defenses that kind of made life hard on Jack Wagner.
Of their 8 games, 2 are FBS, 5 were at the time ranked FCS.
Right. And so, you kind of have to, I mean, Idaho hasn't necessarily had the results offensively, but I think there is potential there against a poor defense. Like Eastern's defense has just been bad. You got to think, if you're an Idaho fan, you're looking at this like, oh, finally a chance for this offense to get going when they fully know what they want to do after, looking at that second half of the Cal Poly game. Right now it's an offense that's hobbled with injuries, right? But they're kind of starting to come into their own identity-wise with Wagner at quarterback. And like you said, if Jack Lane is in, it's a totally different offense. It'll be a lot more, shorter, quick progressions, a lot more using the tight ends, using the running backs and the check down type stuff. And it becomes a little bit more UC Davis-ish with Lane there at quarterback.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say, just because of the injuries we talked about, and Idaho's down 3 linemen as well. Their number 1 tight end, Jake Cox, he's out for the year. Like I already referenced, they started their number 3 running back against Cal Poly. I feel that the second half of Cal Poly is where Idaho more or less figured out with the injuries who they were and what they need to rely on with Wagner, like you said, which is
Mm-hmm.
going back to, hey, play action for the deep shots, try to run the ball. I don't think there's any identity question if Jack Lane is the starter, because that's what this team was like recruited and built for day one. Lane just hasn't been able to have those reps because he went down with a broken collarbone week one.
Right. And it'll be a interesting matchup because I mean it's kind of a team a defense that's been pretty poor, an offense that's been pretty poor. Who's the slightly better of the poor units? We'll see. Let's roll this into the Idaho defense. Obviously, it's been the strength of the team. It's been nationally one of the best defenses in the country. Do you want to talk a little bit about the Idaho defense?
Yeah, well, they stay mostly in kind of base coverage, 4-2-5, a decent amount of cover four. There's the strength is the front seven. I got to start with. Now there are some injury issues here as well, but Keyshawn James Newby, he's edge rusher number one. He was leading the nation in sacks earlier this season. I believe he's got 7 sacks. No, sorry, he has 8 sacks on the year right now. I don't know where that rates nationally, but it's pretty damn good 8 games into the season. Then another guy on the line to pay attention to. His name doesn't necessarily come up quite as much as far as total tackles, but number 52, Dallas Afalava. He's all Big Sky level talent on the D line. Then secondary names to pay attention to: Tommy McCormick, strong safety. He's picked off a pass and returned. He's picked off 2 passes this year, broken up 3, returned one of those picks for a touchdown. He's also one of the guys who he's kind of an emotional leader on the roster. And if you're gonna see a guy who delivers some of the like big sexy hits, it's pretty normal for that to be Tommy McCormick. There are, of course, questions about how stable Idaho's going to be in their cornerbacks. Safeties, they're fine health-wise, but cornerbacks, health is a very real concern. All 4 of their top 4 cornerbacks have, at this moment, have issues related to injury. So it's not even clear how many are going to be available. I believe, safest expectation is that Corey Thomas Jr. and KJ Trujillo, which are kind of the 3 and 4 corners, should be available. Number 2, Abe Williams is not available. Number 1, Andrew Marshall, no one has any clue about right now. So that's kind of secondary. The linebacking core I think they've been solid. It's a super young group led by Jackson Eck, the son of Jason Eck. They've gotten a little bit better as the year. I think the linebacking crew, even though we've had some issues, like we said, with getting to the quarterback, for example, Idaho's not doing quite as well now, I think, due to injuries. Because early in the year, Idaho was playing 10 and 11 D linemen to keep everyone fresh. And like that really wore teams down. That counts Oregon. That counts University of Wyoming. Some FBS schools who should have more depth compared to an FCS roster. But linebackers, I think they've improved as the season's worn on. It's a little bit of a younger crew. You're going to see Zach Johnson. He's a redshirt freshman. He plays quite a bit at the linebacking spot. Another name worth paying attention to, picked off a pass last week, Isaiah King, number 4. He's seen his role increase a little bit. Hey, some of that might be injuries. Some of it has also been he's stepping up. But even with injuries, Idaho's been pretty damn good at stuffing the run. In particular, running rushes between the tackles. Idaho's been good. Now, if they're going to be susceptible, it's a little bit more to the outside. But the way virtually no one, the only team who's been able to exploit Idaho on the ground is Montana State. And that counts Oregon, that counts UC Davis. Through the air is where teams are more likely to have some success against Idaho. You saw the recipe last week from Cal Poly with some of the cushion Idaho had been given in their cover 4. Cal Poly was able to effectively throw essentially a ton of short to intermediate passes across the middle, and that's how they built their drives. But that's kind of what Idaho wants to give up, because you're more likely to give up, some of those bend but don't break yards where teams advance between the 20s, but then they really get shut down, once they get to the red zone. That's mostly been the recipe of success for Idaho, where they're able to limit teams from scoring, obviously. But if you're going to have success, unless you're Montana State, you've got to be able to have a passing attack.
Right. And, Idaho's been super good at stopping the run with only 6 in the box at times, maybe 7. They've been super good just with their front 4 and those 2 linebackers. Mostly Jackson Eck and Zach Johnson have been the main two inside backers that typically stay inside the box. They've been very, very good against the run, but they've struggled at times in the secondary, just because they play that bend but don't break style of defense, which means hey, you got to tackle in the secondary, and they've had a couple lapses in tackling, which we've seen historically from Idaho, like last year when Jared Taylor started the game. They really struggled to tackle the first half of that game. Well, the way that they fixed that problem in the second half last year was bringing in Jackson Eck at middle backer. And I have a feeling that it's going to be really hard to run the ball for the Eagles against this Idaho front four. I think that's a really big matchup that we'll talk about in just a second. But you know, I think the weakness of the Idaho defense kind of is that middle of the field, bend but don't break type style of defense. You have to be able to attack them in the middle of the field, and then you kind of gotta hope for a broken coverage if you want to get further than that. And that's kind of how they've played all year. They just want to rally and tackle. You either got to be able to run the ball, and if you're able to run the ball a little bit on Idaho, what that leads to is the safeties start cheating up a little bit, and that's when you can hit them deep over the middle. They've had a few issues with that, but overall, this is, in my opinion, probably the best defense Eastern will have played uh, going into this game. But definitely the best front four in my opinion. So it'll be a tall task to be able to run the football on them, and you know it'll be a tough matchup, guys.
Yeah, and just another. This is more about like the rhythm of Idaho games right now, which I don't. This isn't like an advantage or disadvantage either way, because Idaho hasn't scored the ball that well on the year. Idaho's had a few games where it feels like the Vandals dominate for like 75 to 80% of the game, but then it's still a one score game where the opposition theoretically, if they got the ball last possession, the team's got a chance to win. It's like reference point for you there. So Idaho beat Abilene Christian 27-24 in week 4 of this season. Idaho completely controlled 85% of that game. And then it was just, your last 15, 20% into the fourth quarter where Idaho not being able to move the ball suddenly created an issue for a team that offensively got a spark. You can use that kind of same template to even talk about Idaho a couple weeks ago at home against Northern Arizona, where it's 23-17 game. Idaho felt like they're in complete control for 3/4 of that game. But again, it's a one-score game. And hey, Cal Poly, now that rhythm was kind of weird, but Idaho, for the majority of the second half, that game looked like a walk-away blowout for Idaho after a rough first half. But then, hey, like a couple miscues, and suddenly Cal Poly is, if they can nail that onside kick, they've got the ball with the chance to win the game. So I mean, that's one thing to just keep in mind for playing Idaho. They can, because of how good they are defensively, they can be kind of a demoralizing team. But without Jack Lane, they also haven't been able to create that separation. So even though you might have a long swath of Idaho completely shutting down the run and being, even when they're exposed in the pass game, they're not bad against the pass. But when they can't create that separation, it's just turned into Idaho games are pretty damn intense because they're just mostly, minus Montana State, they're tight wire to wire.
Right. And one thing to note, like we saw this in the Abilene game, the one thing that I thought Idaho's defense has kind of struggled and not look like a top tier defense is when teams go to tempo and they're just lining up, snap it, go, which is something that Eastern does. That is something to note. It's not as much of Eastern's identity this year as it has been in previous years, that tempo fast stuff. But I mean, Eastern's going to go to it in this game, and that's a big thing to watch for. Is does the tempo allow Eastern to move the ball easier than maybe if Eastern's just lining up wanting to run the ball? I think that is a huge deal if you're an Eastern fan. Tempo has been kind of a relative weakness for that defense, but still, they're
And
still good.
well, that still dates back into last year. So no,
Right.
you're 100% correct. And to me, part of that falls to one, teams being willing to play tempo, and two, teams feeling comfortable enough in their quarterback play to try to risk a little bit more of those intermediate passes against Idaho. Because though we talked about Idaho being susceptible to like I said, tempo to intermediate pass game. The Vandals have been pretty damn good at forcing turnovers this year. So that, I mean, that's part of what you're balancing.
Right. And it flat out, this is probably, I would personally say this is the best defense Eastern has played up until this point of the year. I'm not sure if nationally people will be saying that right now after the Montana State game, but to me, this is the best, most fundamentally sound defense that Eastern has played, and it's going to be tough to really have sustained success. You've got to, Eastern's really going to have to put a lot of pressure on Kiko Vesperis, or they're going to have to be able to run the football. One of those two things kind of has to happen in this game, and will they be able to do it? I don't know. Let's roll this into. Actually, hold up. I always forget to do this because I'm new to this whole thing. We have a sponsor read real quick, so I'm going to do that right now. Shout out to our sponsor, Walk On Apparel. The Eagles Power Hour is sponsored by Walk On Apparel. Walk On Apparel focuses on capturing Eastern's culture and traditions in apparel designs that are as different as they are affordable. Plus 10% of the profit from every sale gets donated right back to the Eagle Athletic Fund. That's a win for you and your alma mater. EPH listeners get 10% off Eastern gear at checkout using code EPH10. That's EPH10. New designs drop throughout the season, so go check out walkon-apparel.com or follow them on Twitter and Instagram to see what's dropping next. That's walkon-apparel.com. Up the fans. All right, keys to the game. What is your biggest key to this game for you? Obviously, you'll say from the Idaho perspective.
Being able to hit those big plays, because until Jack Lane is out there, he's not. So being able to having Jack Wagner be able to complete those play action passes for those chunk gains is foundational to Idaho scoring the football with Wagner under center. Eastern as a secondary is probably it's more analogous to playing Cal Poly than it is to playing Montana State. So you got to think the Idaho, OC Luke Schleisner probably sees the Eastern secondary as something they can exploit. So that's on the offensive side, because I don't, with the running back health and just how Idaho's been running the ball, like they've been okay. Like they're not a catastrophe, but they're certainly not Montana State. Idaho needs those big plays to put some points on the board. So that's what I'm going to say is the key offensively. Defensively, honestly, it's weird thinking keys to the game for Idaho because a lot of it depends on what Eastern wants to do. Eastern is one of the teams in conference that can beat you both through the air and on the ground. And if we're talking offenses strictly, Eastern's been a more dynamic team, scoring the ball, moving the ball than Idaho. So I think the biggest deal for Idaho is to continue to have their success stuffing the run to set up more and more third and longs and try to push Aaron Best to maybe want to call a few more pass plays than he typically wants to. Best is pretty big on trying to have that 50-50-ish split. And, if you're playing Idaho, like look, the jury's in. If you minus Montana State, who it just abuses everyone on the ground in 3 Big Sky games, Idaho's given up 220 yards rushing total. So they've pretty much slammed the door on everyone in Big Sky play. That counts NAU, that counts UC Davis guys. So it's not just Cal Poly. Idaho is able to shut down the run. That's everyone who's not Montana State. So for defensively, getting Eastern into more third and longs and making Best feel like he's got a challenging Best essentially to have to open up the playbook and call more pass plays than he typically wants to, and make Kiko Vesperis beat Idaho. I think that's the key, because if Lane's on there, I'm suddenly thinking we're looking at like a league average offense potentially, and that completely changes the Idaho dynamic. But defensively, they want to make Eastern feel uncomfortable. The hope is they can get to the quarterback a little bit better than the Vandals have the last 2 weeks. They were kick-ass at it the first 7 weeks or so of the season. Just hasn't been quite as effective the last 2. So I don't know. We'll see what that is.
Right. And yeah, those are pretty much the 2 that I was going to hit on too. For Eastern defensively, they have to limit the explosive plays. And, the explosive play, Eastern's never going to be a brick wall defense. That's not what Eastern does. Eastern has to limit explosive plays, and take advantage of turnovers. And they did that in the Sacramento State game. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just doing some math on the ground, like just to contextualize this, where I was talking defensively and how it impacts Eastern on the ground. Minus the Montana State game, which that annihilated Idaho's defensive stats on the ground in Big Sky play. In the other 3 Big Sky games, Idaho's given up 2 yards per rush.
Right.
Like that's how effective they've been. Like if you just are doing box score watch, you're just looking at on the season stats, you're going to miss that. Before, other than Montana State, no one has been able to run the ball at all against Idaho. And that's part of how a team that is the number 11 scoring offense in the Big Sky is a top 10 team in the nation.
Yep. And that's, it's a big deal because it's going to be really tough to run the ball in Idaho. They're so fundamentally sound with that front 6 guys that it's going to be really tough. I think they're even a better rushing defense than UC Davis, who Eastern averaged less than 2 yards a carry against and still ran the ball 30 times. But I'll hit back on the defensive side of things for Eastern. They got to limit the explosive plays. We've seen Eastern have success defensively against a team like Sacramento State. Yeah, they drove the ball down the field, methodically. That's cool. That's how Eastern is able to keep themselves in games and get ahead in games because their offense is good enough to keep up with most offenses. If the defense just slows them down, makes them drive all the way down the field, rather than, against Davis, they gave up 3 50-plus yard touchdowns, if I'm remembering right. And that's where, Eastern loses these back-breaking games. Again, like the Davis game should have been a 7-point game. Eastern lost to, Montana by 3 points, gave up a bunch of explosive plays. If Eastern can just limit the explosive plays, they're good enough to stay in this game and make things happen. And that starts with the secondary communicating better, which was the problem last week, is just the communication overall. And like you said, I mean, I think Eastern, it comes down to Eastern's run game, right? I mean, if they're able to move the ball on the ground, which personally, I don't really see it happening. I think it's going to be really hard to run the football on Idaho. Eastern they have to let Kikoa cook. Like that's been something that I've been, I kind of bounce between run the football and like Kikoa cook. It's like sometimes with Eastern, we'll be in games where we're averaging 6 yards a carry and then we're turning the ball over on 3 straight pass plays. And then we'll be in games where we're averaging 2 yards a carry and we're running it 3 straight times. And that's where our 3 and outs come. And it's like, I think Eastern has to do a good job of recognizing, hey, I mean, I don't think Eastern's going to be able to run the ball. If Eastern is not able to run the ball, and I mean, Eastern's been out, a starting lineman and one of their better running backs too, you got to lean on Chisholm. You got to lean on Kikoa, and you have to try to attack the Idaho defense where they are, softer, the soft spot in the zones, and let guys like Efton Chisholm run after the catch. I think that's where Eastern has to attack Idaho's defenses, kind of flip a page back to the 2010s and just, I don't know if you necessarily go full air raid, but you gotta take advantage of the short pass game and make Idaho's kind of injured-ish secondary come up, make tackles, because I think that's where they've had some struggles so far this year. Do you have any other keys?
Well, I mean, what you're describing is part of what Cal Poly did
right
once Andrew Marshall and then KJ Trujillo, number 3, went down. Those are both cornerbacks for Idaho guys. When both those guys were down, Idaho was having to play their number 5 DB. I mean, that's what Cal Poly started to do, is they saw number 26 lined up on Giancarlo Woods, and like we saw back to back the exact same fade play in the end zone called because they liked that matchup. If Idaho does not have number 7 walking out defensively that first series, Eastern, and hey, just look at the cornerback position. Andrew Marshall's number 7. He's their easily best cornerback.
Yep.
If he is not out there, then your Idaho's best DB is going to be either their number 3 or number 4 corner matched up on Chisholm. Chisholm's one of the best receivers in the country, guys. I mean, if there isn't a relative to playing a good team, like, hey, Idaho, if the playoffs start today, Idaho's in the playoffs for sure. and it's a discussion about if they're going to skip the first round and host or not. That's how this team's been in spite of injuries. You're not going to get matchups better than that against good teams than if you see Idaho trot out there and both at number 7 is not there lined up on Chisholm.
Right. I think just got to put pressure on the secondary to tackle if you're Eastern, and we will see if that happens. All right. Let's roll this into the Big Sky Pick'em segment. There's only 3 games, and just for you, Brian, this podcast will come out after Tubs at the Club is live tonight, so you're not spoiling your picks for the big show. Let's go first off with allegedly the Big Sky game of the week, according to the conference. Montana going to Northern Colorado.
Yeah. I'm really glad that you brought that up about allegedly the game of the week. Okay, so here's the thing. Montana is scoring 43.7 points per game in conference. Like, they've just been lighting teams up. I mean, hey, Eastern guys, if you're listening to it, obviously you saw this in your matchup with Montana. That Montana's kind of weirdly been like a Bo Baldwin-esque kind of team where they can score all they want and they cannot stop anyone. The downside for Northern Colorado is they stop themselves pretty damn well. They're scoring 15 points a game in conference. I know they're coming off a couple weeks ago. They had a bye last week. They had their first win since 2022 over Weber, which Weber gifted that game. So no, I'd like Montana's going to win. I don't think it's going to be close.
Yep, I'm in the same boat. Montana is relatively good. They're going to score a lot of points. Northern Colorado, excuse me, not Weber. Northern Colorado's not good. They're not going to score a lot of points. I think it's a pretty easy one to pick. This would be a very funny Grizz just ultimate collapse moment if they played a close game with Northern Colorado. Literally, the town of Missoula might burn down, but I think Montana wins this one. They're favored by like 25 points. So I think.
Question is what's Cal Poly's route to putting points on the board? They're the number 11 passing team in Big Sky. They're the number 10 team in the Big Sky. Like, they just don't do anything well offensively at all.
Right. I think the way that Northern Colorado has a chance to do anything is all they do is run the football, and Montana hasn't really stopped people on the ground very well. I think that's their one chance, but also Montana knows they're going to run every play, and I think they're good enough talent-wise to stuff them.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, we don't need to talk Northern Colorado any longer. Like, if you guys don't want to, they're struggling, man, and that's how 2024 is going to be for Northern Colorado.
All right, next game, Sacramento State is traveling to Pocatello to take on Idaho State, who kind of feels like they got shafted by the refs last week, which they they did. It was a 4-point game. Idaho State was driving late in the game. It should have been a 3-point game because NAU missed a PAT. Then it was reviewed. It was ruled no good on the field. It was reviewed. Clearly, the football is going outside of the goalpost, and it was reversed and turned into a good PAT. That changed it from a 4-point game or 3-point game to a 4-point game. While Idaho State was on the plus 15 yard line with 10 seconds remaining. If it's a 3-point game, they just kick a field goal, go to overtime, and all of a sudden it's a whole different game. Anyways, Sacramento State at Idaho State. What are you feeling for this one?
Man, this is both these teams are two of the harder teams to pick in the conference because Idaho State, they're 1-3 in conference. Of the lower tier of bottom 4 teams in the conference, I think Idaho State is like the least friendly matchup that you have. They're kind of like the inverse of an old school Cal Poly team. Cal Poly used to run triple option back in the day. Idaho State is throwing the ball a lot more than most of the conference, and quarterback Kobe Tracy he's a transfer from Utah Tech. For the most part of the season, Tracy's been pretty good. Like against NAU, that's a top 25-ish matchup. Through 271 yards, 2 touchdowns. Accuracy wasn't fantastic. Then you always have the curveball of Hunter Hayes, the backup quarterback, who's also like their number 1 rusher, but they don't just call rushing plays for Hayes. He's an effective passer too. So Idaho State, they have weapons offensively, but they aren't scoring the ball that well. Sorry, they're not stopping teams defensively that well. My bad. Idaho State's scoring just fine. Sacramento State, early in Big Sky play looked just completely lost offensively, then just put up 55 on Weber State, and what Sac State every game is pretty much must win from this point on for them.
Yep.
So I'm gonna lean Sacramento State. Sacramento State for a lot of the season they've just packed, like they have just got TFL after TFL against against teams who are not like top of the conference ish. They've been pretty damn good at getting penetration. And Idaho State might be a matchup that's a little more favorable for them. I also just think with what Idaho State can do defensively, Carson Conklin's probably going to feel a little more comfort, which is secondary for Sac State. I mean, last week, I think Sac State figured out like what they need to do offensively is get Elijah Tautolover the ball as much as they can in as many ways as they can. Which last week was both through the air and on the ground. So maybe Andy Thompson figured out something for Sac State offensively last week against Weber, which is making me think, yeah, I'll go Sac State.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat as you. I think Sac State's going to be able to run the football all over Idaho State, unless Idaho State plays like 8 men in the box. But if that happens, Carson Conklin's good enough, and Gibson are good enough to hit a couple big plays, and even Anderson Grover's been really good for them. So I just think Sac State is a way better team. They're underperforming right now. And I think they're a team with the talent to be probably a top 3 or 4 team in the Big Sky, and they've just been throwing games away, playing bad, and that's kind of how my interpretation of Sac State this year. I think they'll be the what's interesting about this is Sac State's secondary has not been good, and Idaho State is going to throw the ball a lot. I think this is another one of those like really weird high scoring games. Kind of similar to the Weber game last week, but I think in the end, Sac State will prevail. I think they're just a better team overall.
Yeah, that matchup that you talked about, just talk Idaho State defensively, number 12 rushing defense in conference, aka last, giving up 13 rushing touchdowns, aka last. So no, I think that's it. I think you nailed it. This is if you're going to pick a game this week that's going to be tight and high scoring, it's this game because you have strength on weakness matchups on both sides.
Right. And we saw that earlier at Portland State, and Portland State just ran it all over them.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll move.
Cal Poly almost beat Idaho State, relying on Richie Watts as a running quarterback. Just Idaho State can't stop anyone on the ground.
Right. All right, let's move on to the big game that we've been talking about: Eastern Washington at Idaho. I'll let you go first. Again, we're not spoiling the Tubs at the Club Big Sky Pick'em because it's coming out tomorrow. But how are you feeling this game's going to go?
Man, I have to hedge this pick, dude, because if Jack Lane plays and Idaho's got a league average offense, that completely changes the dynamic of what you expect out of this Vandal team. And realistically, this is kind of Idaho's Super Bowl, as in the Vandals run by next week. If Lane doesn't play this week, they're off next week, he should be in against Portland State in 2 weeks. So this game is huge for Idaho as far as like a marker in the season to get through and finally get to that rest point. So Idaho, for the most part this season, they've played in tight games, but they've responded well to the adversity they faced via injury. And even in games where they're not, you're seeing some difficulty, especially on the offensive side of the ball. When you're not talking Montana State, Idaho's mostly put together. Hell, even their loss to Davis, Idaho with backup Jack Wagner playing, Idaho should have won that game 7 different ways. So I think it's going to be tight. I'm gonna bank on Idaho winning. I think it'll be something like 24-21, 24-20, something like that, where Idaho is able to exploit Eastern's secondary a little bit, but just a little bit. Idaho's mostly played tight games. Eastern, even though their record, they're 2-5 right now in the season, Patty.
Yep.
Probably might be the most talented 2-5 team I've ever seen in my life, and maybe the most talented 2-5 team I'm gonna see in my life. So there's ways Eastern has some matchups, as we talked about earlier, in particular if they'll let themselves lean on Kakova Vesperis. There's some advantage there for Eastern in the passing game, but I do think Idaho's going to be able to just beat Eastern's ass on the ground. They're going to completely stuff Eastern's run game, and I think that's where Eastern's going to get in some of those scenarios where you're more likely to have turnovers. And you know how momentum works, from watching games. Idaho's really a momentum team as well. That's the whole big play thing, right? Is A big play on defense can lead to a big play on offense, and suddenly you force a turnover and you score in a minute or so. That's kind of what Idaho's been having to ride. So yeah, I think it's going to be close, but I think I'd pick Idaho 24-20.
Right. I think you hit the momentum thing is huge because Eastern's the same way. Like they're very much a momentum team that if they can build some momentum, all of a sudden they're pretty dangerous. We saw that in the second half versus Montana. We saw that in the third quarter versus Davis coming back from 28-9 down, and then all of a sudden it's a 7 point game. Like, Eastern is very much a momentum team. The issue is they tend to give up big plays, which are huge momentum swings the other way. And that has been the issue for Eastern, and that's what Idaho wants to do. So, I
Well,
mean,
you'd also told me, like, because hey, full disclosure, guys, Patty and I talk. Patty joins me on Big Sky Podcast Network Power Rankings a lot. We talk Big Sky football a lot. You had told me specifically that Eastern biting on play action has
right,
just been a huge struggle for this team. And if Wagner's playing, that's where Idaho's been most effective passing the ball.
exactly. And that's where I'm not feeling super great about this as an Eastern fan. And what I found this year is when I'm feeling very not confident in a game, that's when Eastern wins games for whatever reason. But because I thought Eastern was going to get their butts kicked by Sac State. We go and win. Then I was feeling relatively confident against UC Davis, and we kind of get our butts kicked for most of that game. So I'm not feeling great about this matchup. And I think the issue is Eastern's just not going to be able to slow down the big plays. And I think Eastern's going to get in their own way offensively. I have a feeling that Eastern is going to try to, kind of impose their will on the ground against, light boxes because that's what Idaho has done. They've played 6, maybe 7 in the box, and then they've still been able to stop the run anyways. So, I think Idaho wins this game. I think it might be a little bit higher scoring than 21-20 or whatever. I think this game ends up in the 30s, which kind of might sound a little nuts, but I think this is going to be similar to the Cal Poly game. I think Eastern might look pretty good in stretches, but overall, I think Idaho is just right now probably the better. I think they're the better coach team. I think they'll be the better prepared team. And Eastern will have streaks where they lean on Kikoa or they make a turnover or something and they look unstoppable for like a quarter, and then they'll just look really bad again. I think this one ends something like 32-28. That's my guess.
So, a question for you then, just so I covered the hedge. You're describing if Jack Wagner is lined
Correct.
up under center for Idaho. Let's spend
Right.
like 1 second. What if it's Jack Lane? What's your
If
prediction then?
if it's Jack Lane, I almost feel like it'd be relatively similar just because that's how Easterns play. Like they tend to play to a competition relatively. Like they've played to the good teams and they've played to the bad teams they've played. And like I think Eastern will hang around if it's Lane. I just think Lane will absolutely dissect Eastern's defense. The one thing about Eastern's defense, it is kind of hard to, at times that they kind of like do weird stuff on the coverage end where quarterbacks will just be like, "What the heck am I?" and then they just dump it off. I think Lane's good enough to be able to kind of dissect it or whatever, but also I'm sure there'll be a little bit of rust for Lane after not playing for 6 to 8 months, and luckily for Eastern, I don't think the deep
You mean six
ball
to eight weeks?
or yeah, weeks, geez, months.
Yeah.
But like I don't think the strength of Lane necessarily is the deep ball where I think that's where, Eastern has had their issues is the big play issues like giving up these massive deep balls, wide open guys. The guys that have been catching the ball deep are wide open, but I think it'll be a similar game either way. I think it's just how Idaho goes about it is a little bit different. But yeah, I think the results will be about the same either way. Uh, you know, I think this is where Idaho like all of a sudden looks pretty good offensively. So
Yeah, see, the way I differ there is I think if Lane's under center, it's a different game plan to prep against. That there's essentially no tape for anyone
right,
on what, unless you think there's value in the Oregon game, which for FCS play, I'd say there probably isn't a ton. But I with Lane under center, Idaho's going to have the ability to have, they're more likely to be able to have those longer drives, which is what the team wants in
True.
the first place. That's going to put Eastern on ice offensively. If he's there, that plus just there's a little bit, I think there's a little bit of this the inverse prep factor like Idaho had last year against Eastern.
Yep.
When was it? Who was the starting quarterback? Was it Jared Taylor last year?
Yeah,
For
Taylor
Eastern?
started last year.
Yeah, when
And it
he
was his
started.
first start ever.
Yeah, and Eastern went run heavy. It took Idaho half a game to like figure out exactly how they're really going to handle that. I think you could have that dynamic on the Idaho end, but just because of how Idaho's been defensively with Lane, I think you can look at some margin for error heading into the second half in a way that Idaho just hasn't. They haven't had a ton of that against better teams.
Right. And that's Eastern's given up that margin for error in the first half a lot this year. They've looked Eastern has looked so bad in the first half of some of these games. Like you look at the Montana game, you look at the UC Davis game, Eastern's in a huge hole. They climb their way back, but it's just they can't climb far enough. And I kind of could see that happening again on Saturday. All right. And you have any final thoughts before we wrap it up here?
No, man, it's good to be on the other show. Return the favor once in a while.
Sweet. All right. Yeah. Get to Moscow on Saturday. It's only an hour and a half drive from Cheney. It's a fun place. Kibbe Dome's fun. I've been to plenty of games there as a guy that went to school there a couple of years. But it's a fun place. It's usually a really fun environment and like hostile and fun to go back and forth and stuff. And it'll be a good time. And tailgate food in Moscow, very good, I will say. All right. Check out Tubs of the Club. We will be, well, I guess this is coming out after the live, but Tubs of the Club will have a Eastern preview coming out that I may or may not be making an appearance on as well. Brian, you can follow Brian on Twitter. I'll have all of his stuff linked down below. Yeah, that's all we got, guys. Thanks everyone for listening, and go Eags.
Go Vandals.